Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. I'm very excited to have our panelists on today to talk about some of the most important questions that we're facing as we come through a time of great crisis. We're still in the middle of great crisis. We're entering a period of great uncertainty, more difficulty ahead. And there are a lot of important questions that all of our systems in the public workforce system, higher education, the private sector and employers are going to be facing big questions, hopefully also big opportunities to make some change, some structural change, and really address the systemic problems that we're seeing on a systemic level. Coming out of a pandemic and social upheaval, it's clear that people are not satisfied anymore with the status quo. Many were not even coming into this, but it's clear now that it won't be tolerated. And we have we're also going to be facing a lot of demands on these systems, new demands, financial constraints from the private sector, from higher ed and others. And so let's talk a little bit about how we can address these issues on a systemic level and hopefully move forward with some kind of strategic sense of the changes that need to be made. I want to talk first to our panelists about, or ask them first, give us a snapshot of where we were coming into the multiple crises that we're facing right now. Your various systems, higher ed, public workforce, private sector, what were some of the strengths and resources you have coming into this, and what were some of the bigger challenges that you were facing? And Ted, I'll ask you to go first.
Great, thanks, Lauren, and welcome everybody. Glad to have you all on board for this journey. Higher education back in the good old days, which let's go all the way back to maybe January. Higher ed, I think, was firing on all cylinders when it came to addressing issues of access. We've been working very hard over a number of decades to open the doors of higher education, not only to traditional age students, but to more and more work age students, and that'll be a theme for our conversation today. And I think we were doing a good job. On the other side of the equation, we had a persistent and little talked about completion crisis. Students were getting in, but they weren't getting out. It was contributing to the problems that individuals have with student loans. They would borrow money, get partway through their degree, not get that degree premium as they entered the workforce. So a completion problem. And then I'll stop with an important recognition that we were not doing well in helping students of color, particularly Black Americans, achieve their college dreams. And so as we use this as a moment of reflection, that certainly informs the debate about how to make the system of higher education be far more an engine of social mobility and particularly racial justice.
Thank you. Nicole?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. And thank you, everyone, for having us here today. I will say coming into this crisis, it was clear that the economy was at a significant level of just progress. And we know that the Dow was fairly high, as well as unemployment generally incredibly low historically. And over the past 2.5 months, we've seen an increase of unemployment claims exponentially up to upwards of 41 million individuals who have now filed claims, particularly, as Ted mentioned, across multiple sectors and industries that have disproportionately impacted particular groups of individuals, disproportionately people of color. And because those occupations and industries tend to be concentrated around the frontline workforce within retail, hospitality, and food services. That being said, we've also had to contend with a workforce system that frankly was not prepared to have 41 plus million unemployment claims, and instead just several million unemployment claims. And so you have an overburdened workforce system that now has to manage the influx of claimants. How do you ensure that capital is allocated appropriately to those individuals within a particular amount of time to get them that necessary resources to pay their rent, to pay medical bills, to get them access to education? And then finally, from an employer perspective, I think you've seen a shift where employers were really working from a space of having increased recruitment and bringing individuals into their systems, and now not only having to potentially lay off workers, but having to manage a response in a global pandemic, i.e., individuals now working from home, or to the extent that they're going back to work, having to social distance, having to distance within the office place, such that you cannot have 100% of your workforce in your office as previously managed by these employers. So you're dealing with a multiple level of factors that have really come together that I think these different systems have had to manage and work through these challenges effectively.
Thank you. Casey?
And I would sort of move us into present times. If the good old days were January, the one thing that I would add to both what Ted and Nicole are talking about is that we had a huge skills gap before the pandemic, that we had 7 million jobs that we couldn't fill because people don't have the skills that are required for a variety of different jobs across a variety of different sectors. We have, in many parts of the country, a critical nursing shortage, and we have manufacturing jobs and IT jobs that before we even hit pandemic level had a problem and a real mismatch with the skills that people had and the jobs that were available to them. And so while higher education maybe was running on all cylinders, we were still definitely leaving people out. And some of that makes some of the equity problems that Ted was really talking about even worse than we may have recognized. And so then bringing us to current, Congress authorized the CARES Act, and that specifically hits the education space. So $30.75 billion infused into education across the country in a few different pools of funds. So there's discretionary grants, there's governor's grants, K-12 and higher education funding. And I think the current challenge that we're moving into now, kind of in terms of immediacy, is how do we plan? What does summer look like? What does fall look like? How do we have multiple contingency plans for our learners and multiple contingency plans to fill those skills gaps so that we can move people into employment where it does exist in our communities?
So you started discussing sort of what the immediate needs are now. And Nicole also mentioned, these systems are already overburdened. They were not prepared. We were not prepared coming out of historically low unemployment for suddenly this massive influx of unemployment claims, and obviously the skill requirements, the need to get people the right skills so that they can find jobs if and when, hiring has already begun. Last week's report showed that 2.5 million jobs had come back. So hiring is beginning. How do we make sure people have the right skills? How do we make sure education programs are set up to provide what people need? Let's talk about the short term. For the next 12 months, what can various systems do? Casey, you started talking a little bit about some of the money being infused into the public workforce system, but I think given George Floyd's death and the protests that are out there, the previous solutions to crisis are also not going to be sufficient in terms of what people are looking for and the change that people want to see and the true solutions they want to see. So right now we're all in crisis mode. There's mass unemployment. There's a growing sense, again, the status quo won't be tolerated. So people want to see change. What do you think your various systems can or need to be doing right now to satisfy the desire for change and also meet some of those really intense needs that are out there to just keep people surviving and make sure their basic needs are met and hopefully set them up also for the next phase?
So I'll dive in. I think that when we think about this, and the numbers are really astounding, right? 30 to 40 million people unemployed. I think that we tend to think about the solutions as giant scale solutions. That's the right way to think about it. But I think in this instance, we need to think about scale as almost a mass customization exercise. So each one of those 35 million people has a different story to tell. Each one has a different set of skills. Each one may be able to approach an employer with a different skills portfolio. From a higher ed point of view, I think it's really incumbent on us to be better about naming the skills students and learners are assembling as they go through our experiences, name them and certify them in smaller bites, and be able to then offer them into the employment world in ways that can be consumed by both the learner and the employer. So I'm talking about certifications that are underneath a degree, specializations, competencies that are embedded in a degree but now need to be highlighted. Today, the Department of Ed and ACE announced the release of a report on the utility of blockchain in being able to provide a way for institutions and learners to put in one place a learning record that is then accessible to the learner and promotable by the learner to potential employers. That enables this kind of bite-sized learning to be promoted across different industries and, frankly, across the lifespan. So we're excited about that. We've also got some money behind it to be able to support innovations using blockchain to do just what I'm talking about over the next year.
And I think, to Ted's point about the ways in which these systems can work more efficiently, it really comes down to providing and facilitating information and transparency into, as Casey outlined, what are these skills gaps? How can you better leverage data to inform the investments and resources needed as we're creating these jobs of tomorrow? One thing that is incredibly common over the past 3 months has been the significant shift in workforce. You've had mass displacement of particular jobs and an influx of other jobs. And how do we ensure that there is visibility into those respective skills? We do that through leveraging not only traditional sources of data from the Department of Labor, BLS, ONET, but non-traditional sources of data. LinkedIn is sitting on a trove of data through our economic graph that we've been providing to policymakers around the country and around the world for the past 5+ years to really ensure that they're able to inform investments in the workforce. And as Ted referenced with respect to interoperable learning records and certifications and credentials, to the extent that you have an educational and workforce system working more in tandem, then you can optimize for getting individuals back into work faster and ideally into more sustainable jobs. One other piece of this is really opening the aperture for online providers. And so, for instance, LinkedIn Learning has 16,000 courses that we're hoping to get to market as much as possible to help facilitate access to this online content for any individual who may need it virtually. And I think you've seen an increase in the level of online content available for consumers, people who are unemployed, and people who are at the margins.
I've been doing some reporting on, the sort of the unemployment to reemployment kind of path. And one of the most chilling things that economists that I've spoken to say, which, is not a surprise, and we know this from the last recession, when employers lay people off, they don't hire those same people back when the economy improves. A lot of that is because the skills change. They often take a downturn to invest in new technologies, maybe automation, retool some of their processes. That means that the skills they're looking for are different. And I think that puts an additional burden on the workforce development system because there's so much forecasting that has to happen. We have to get better about using the data that LinkedIn and others have to really be very intentional and careful. Another thing, and maybe Casey, you can speak to this. Something I've seen in the workforce development system or the public workforce system. A lot of times the goal is to get somebody reemployed as quickly as possible, but not necessarily reemployed in the best way possible, or in a job that has growth possibilities, or getting somebody from what might be kind of a stopgap position into something that really has a career path to it, out of a dead-end job and onto a career path. So, that I want to get to sort of what are some of the long-term solutions we can be thinking about, again, to make these systems create, strategic solutions for these systems that are sustainable, that really address, again, the systemic problems that we're seeing. I don't have the answers. I'm hoping you all do.
So yes, please let me address that. If I could, I'd like to go back to your equity question, because the Department of Education actually has been doing some really interesting things in career and technical education that I feel like is worth mentioning to the audience. Perkins was reauthorized in the summer of 2018. And so when an act's reauthorized, states write new plans. And the cool thing about this Perkins reauthorization is it makes equity a really central focus of the plan. And states just in April turned in their new plans, and we've been approving them and launching some of those that are really exceptional. So you can check out the Department of Education Twitter feed just for more information about what states are doing around their Perkins plans. But they specifically have to disaggregate program level data around issues of race, gender, veteran student status, disability, low income and homeless student status. They're called special populations within Perkins. And so states are really asked to intentionally dig in and figure out where are their gaps, and then to use the dollars to do things that are intentional to help students. So for example, in Colorado, where I spent almost a decade, we looked at our data and we knew we had some serious problems with particularly Black and Hispanic students getting through STEM programs. They were starting, so that access problem was not a problem, like Ted mentioned before, but they weren't completing. And so within the Colorado Community College system, they spent a lot of very intentional time saying, how do we address this equity gap for these particular populations of students? So they're using the data, they're looking at, something with intentionality, and the Perkins Act reauthorization asks every state to do that and to do a local needs assessment. So to really dig into their own labor market data so that they're also spending money on programs where students have good labor market needs. So if you know you've saturated your market with cosmetologists, maybe it doesn't make sense to continue to offer that particular program. But if you know that you have a lot of need in that area, then it would make more sense to leverage your grant funds to be able to do something like that. So I'm seeing states also change how they're making investments and focusing more on IT and advanced manufacturing, bioinformatics, industries of the future, that there really is that potential for the ongoing employment. And that's a real shift. But it takes a lot of time. So the act was reauthorized 18 months ago. We're to a point now where they've got new plans, and then we won't see data coming in from those new plans for still just over a year. So it's a real process, but I am excited and very encouraged by what I'm seeing states do in that space. And then your next question was really about the future and what are the changes that we need to make and to be more intentional. I would actually point folks to Missouri. They've done some really interesting things where they've put their state workforce system in with their higher education system. So they've aligned their state process, and they're creating a lot more intentionality about how do we get students from education into work. Certainly things that I would highlight that I think will make a big difference are initiatives like short-term Pell. Right now we have workforce training dollars in a dozen different federal agencies, and we could make that a lot more transparent through the Pell program. So things like USDA has training dollars and DOL has training dollars, and some of those pay for short-term programs, but you also have the additional barrier as a learner to qualify for WIOA or qualify for SNAP. And people seem to really understand the Pell process. So short-term Pell has some real potential. And certainly Second Chance Pell would sort of cross both of these lines. Second Chance Pell is a program where folks who are experiencing incarceration can get access to federal dollars to be able to pay for higher education while they're incarcerated. And so that's been a program that we've tried really hard to expand with an experimental site, and really hope that Congress will pick that up in a reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, because it would not only provide more access to people, but there's a lot of intentionality there.
Thanks, Ted.
I think totally behind everything that Casey has said, and really happy to see that a number of those programs have continued from the previous administration through this one, and we're very supportive at ACE. As I think about your question, Lauren, I think that if you look at the map of the United States, the sensors that are on the ground that help connect training and employment are the country's community colleges. They are the institutions that are closest to the ground. They are the ones who are doing the close-in labor market analysis that Casey referred to. They are the ones who should be fostering, and many are, fostering relationships with industries as they make this transition from one kind of employment to another, from one kind of workforce to another. And so I've been very heartened by the way America's community colleges have responded to the previous recession and tooling up to do the same in the current recession. And I think that's why, coming back to this one note that I've got today, I think that's why the interoperability and transportability of student learning records are so important, and why there are opportunities for us to use technology tools to make those records accessible to both learners and employers.
Nicole, with the perspective of millions of employers being on LinkedIn, where do you think the private sector, where you can't do quite this level of coordination that you can from the government or from a higher ed system where there are organizations serving the whole system, how can the private sector be a little more intentional about some of these questions?
Yeah, I think the private sector can be more intentional through providing additional partnerships, as Ted mentioned, with the key stakeholders, i.e. working very closely with educational institutions, whether they be community colleges, online institutions, really understanding what the supply side of the workforce looks like, i.e. what are those competencies, what are those skill sets, how do we ensure that those competencies and skill sets align with the demand side of the workforce. And once you're able to provide more visibility into that, then I think you can create optimization within the marketplace such that, as you mentioned, Lauren, you have individuals who are not only prepared for the jobs of today, but can withstand some of these disruptions and be in a sustainable position long term. I think what we're seeking is individuals who can actually stay in these jobs long term, contribute, be trained appropriately by employers and by other stakeholders, and really create efficiency in the workforce system, such that we're not talking about 41 million individuals who are unemployed. We're getting back to numbers that were relatively consistent with a strong workforce system.
When unemployment was low, employers were desperate for people. There was a lot more incentive for them to create those partnerships and be involved in them. Kind of helping build their own workforce of the future. Obviously, we're going to see a lot of cuts to programs that are not considered absolutely core and essential. So there was a lot of innovation happening in the last few years, and how can we kind of keep that going? How do you sustain that even when organizations, companies, institutions have fewer resources to put to it in the short term, but even if it's, can be very helpful for them in the long term? How do you keep the innovation going, basically?
So I think that key to keeping the innovation going is a match between supply and demand, as Nicole said. And I think that coming out of this, there will be growing demand. It's likely to be different demand. I think that's where we need to gear the innovation. How can we quickly change the workforce training opportunities for people to be more nimble, more flexible, not aiming at perhaps long-term degrees, but at training and certificate programs that are more carefully attuned to the individual demand needs of individual segments in the marketplace. So that's where I see the innovation happening, and happening first and sticking around for a while, because I think that this need for retraining for 35-40 million Americans is going to be with us for not just a year or 6 months, but for years to come.
And I would just add that it's actually beneficial for employers to maintain their current employee base, i.e. invest in them, provide on-the-ground training, and keep them in those jobs, as opposed to, one, recruiting new talent, after identifying new talent, having the jobs, vacant for an exponential period of time while you're searching for that talent. There's a significant cost that's associated with that. And so it actually is important for employers, even at this time, to invest in their current workforce, identify those innovative partnerships that can happen across education and the workforce systems, and keep individuals in those jobs for as long as possible.
And I would add, any employers in the room, go check out your local community college. Most of them will customize your workforce development solutions for you. They really want to be responsive, and they're very interested in getting students directly into jobs. So whatever it is you've said that you need in your workforce, work with your community college to really provide that to people who actually want to live and work in your community.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, so I want to thank our panelists one more time. Thank you for being with us, also to the audience, and so glad these conversations are happening, and let's keep them going.